The great hall of the Iron Veil Pack smelled of burning resin, candle wax, and the dark wine flowing freely into pewter cups. Black leather banners bearing the symbol of the Howling Wolf hung from stone walls, and torches cast long shadows across the faces of the guests. It was the night of the Crescent Moon Banquet, the most important event on the Pack's calendar, when neighboring clans gathered to renew alliances, present heirs, and above all, observe who the Alpha King would choose to sit at his side. Emma carried a silver tray of filled cups when she slipped through the side door of the hall. She was 23 years old, her blonde hair braided over one shoulder, her gray wool cloak exchanged for the plain linen uniform of the castle servants, a pale dress cinched at the waist with a worn leather belt, soft boots that made no sound on the stone floor. She had learned long ago how to move without being noticed. In a place like Iron Veil Keep, invisibility was not a weakness, it was survival. She wove between lords and ladies without brushing a single elbow, her eyes low, her steps measured. The hall was crowded with alphas from 3 different territories. She recognized the red and gold colors of Clan Ashford on the far side of the room, and the dark green of Clan Morrow near the fireplace. At the center of it all, raised on a stone dais, sat the long table where the highest-ranking members of Iron Veil dined. She did not look at the head of that table. She never did. Not because she feared Ronan. Every servant in the keep feared the Alpha King in some measure. His silence alone could empty a corridor. But Emma's reasons were quieter and older than fear. Looking at Ronan meant remembering things she had buried carefully beneath years of work and silence, and she had no interest in digging them up tonight. She set 2 cups before a pair of visiting lords and turned to go. "You missed one." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, with the particular weight of someone who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. Emma turned slowly. Lord Cedric of Clan Ashford was leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who considered the world his personal furniture. He was handsome in an obvious way, broad jaw, copper-colored hair swept back, rings on 3 fingers. He was also, Emma knew, the man who had asked her to wait for him 3 months ago in the eastern courtyard, who had pressed her hand between both of his and said words she had been foolish enough to believe. "I will declare you before the clans, Emma. I will make it known that you are mine." She had sewn a ribbon into the hem of her dress that night. A small, ridiculous thing. Pale blue, the color of the Ashford crest. She had told no one, not even her friend Sarah, who shared her quarters in the servants' wing. She had simply sewn it there and let herself feel something she almost never allowed. Hope. That ribbon was still in her dress tonight. She looked at the empty cup in front of him. She filled it without a word. "No greeting?" Cedric asked. There was amusement in his tone, the lazy amusement of someone testing an animal they believed was tame. "Good evening, my lord," Emma said quietly. "Sit with me," he said, "just for a moment." "I am working, my lord." "You are always working." He reached out and caught the edge of her tray. Not hard, just enough to stop her. "I want to speak with you. There are things I intended to say tonight." Emma's heart did something treacherous and involuntary. She steadied it. "I will be finished with my duties after the 3rd bell," she said carefully. "If you wish to speak, my lord, I can—" "Cedric." The voice came from across the table. A woman. Young, dark-haired, draped in Ashford red and gold with a necklace of amber that caught the firelight. She was watching Emma with the patient expression of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the other party to understand it. "Your father is asking for you." Cedric released the tray. He straightened in his chair, and the amusement faded from his face, replaced by something Emma recognized too late as discomfort. He did not look at Emma when he said it. "This is Mira, my intended." He reached across the table and covered the dark-haired woman's hand with his. "We announced it this afternoon. I meant to tell you before tonight, but—" Emma stopped hearing him. It was not dramatic, the way it happened inside her. There was no crack, no flood. It was more like a door being closed very softly in a room she had almost allowed herself to enter. She looked at Mira. who looked back at her with the polite blankness of someone who had never considered Emma a threat, and therefore felt no need to be unkind. She looked at Cedric, who was now talking about timing and family obligations, his voice an even murmur beneath the noise of the hall. She thought about the ribbon sewn into her hem. "Congratulations, my lord," Emma said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "My lady." She dipped her chin toward Mira, turned, and walked away from the table with her back straight, and the tray balanced perfectly in both hands. She made it to the corridor before her hands began to shake. She set the tray on a stone ledge and pressed her palms flat against the cold wall. The sounds of the banquet filtered through the heavy door. Laughter, the scrape of benches, someone calling for more wine. She breathed in slowly, breathed out. The stone was rough and real beneath her fingers. "You knew," she told herself. "You always knew this was possible. You knew and you hoped anyway. That was your mistake." She stood there for a long moment in the corridor lit by a single torch, alone, and she did not cry. She was very practiced at not crying in places where someone might walk past and see. What she did not know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that at the head of the great table, the Alpha King had watched her cross the hall, watched her stop at Cedric's chair, and watched her walk away. Ronan had not moved. He sat exactly as he always sat, straight, still, one hand resting on the arm of his carved chair, his ice-blue eyes calm. He had not appeared to be watching anything in particular. The lords to his left and right would have said, if asked, that the king had been listening to the trade discussion about the northern passes. But he had watched Emma set down the tray. He had watched her press her hands against the wall. And something shifted, very slightly, behind those cold eyes. He reached for his cup, drank slowly, set it down again. And he made a decision that he did not examine too closely, because if he examined it, he might find it was not the kind of decision a king should make, based on 40 seconds of watching a servant girl hold herself together in an empty corridor. He would follow her tonight. Not now. Later, when the hall grew loud and no one watched the doors. He did not ask himself why. The third bell rang across the keep, and Emma was already gone from the hall. She had finished her rounds with the mechanical precision of someone who had long since separated her hands from her heart. Fill, serve, step back, move on. No one had spoken to her again. Cedric had not looked in her direction. Mira had laughed at something a visiting lord said, and the amber necklace had caught the firelight beautifully, and Emma had carried her empty tray back to the kitchen without incident. Sarah was waiting for her near the hearth, her dark curly hair pinned back and her apron already untied, the universal signal that she considered her duties finished regardless of what the head housekeeper thought. Sarah was 26, sharp-tongued, loyal without condition, and the only person in Ironvale Keep who knew about the ribbon. She took one look at Emma's face and said nothing. That was one of the things Emma loved most about her. They walked together through the servants' corridor in silence, past the storage rooms and the laundry alcove, and the narrow staircase that led to their shared quarters on the second floor of the east wing. Only when the door was closed behind them and the latch dropped did Sarah finally speak. "He announced her tonight," she said. It was not a question. At the afternoon gathering, apparently. Emma sat on the edge of her bed and reached down to the hem of her dress. Her fingers found the ribbon without looking. She pulled at the small knot, and it came loose in her hand. Pale blue, no longer than her thumb, slightly frayed at one end where she had cut it from an old spool. She held it for a moment, then set it on the wooden nightstand. "I should go." Sarah frowned. "Go where? It is past the third bell, Emma. It is cold and dark." "I know." Emma was already reaching for her gray cloak. "I need air. I need to walk somewhere that does not smell like his wine and her perfume." "Then walk to the kitchen garden. Walk to the—" "I am going to the river." Sarah went quiet. She knew what the river meant. It was the place Emma went when things became too heavy to carry inside stone walls. a path through the forest behind the eastern gate, a 20-minute walk through pine and wet earth, ending at a wide, shallow river where the current ran fast enough to be loud and the sound covered everything else. Emma had discovered it in her first winter at the keep, when she had been new and frightened and homesick for a home that no longer existed. "It is the middle of the banquet night," Sarah said carefully. "The eastern gate will be guarded. Oswin is on the eastern gate tonight. He will let me through." Emma fastened the cloak at her throat. "I will be back before the 4th bell. Do not wait up." Sarah looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of someone who had many things to say, and was choosing, with great effort, to say none of them. Then she sat on her own bed, picked up the small piece of pale blue ribbon from the nightstand, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. "I will keep this," she said simply. "You do not need it anymore." Emma paused at the door. Something tightened briefly in her chest, and then released. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for more than the ribbon. The eastern gate was indeed guarded by Oswin, a broad, gray-haired wolf of 60 who had been at the keep since before Emma was born, and who regarded her with the gruff affection of a man who had watched her grow from a frightened girl of 19 into whatever she was now. He opened the small side door without being asked, only saying as she passed, "River path is muddy past the 2nd pine. Watch your boots." "Thank you, Oswin." "Back before 4th bell," he said to her back. She raised a hand to show she had heard. The forest received her the way forests always did, with indifference, and therefore with a kind of relief. The path was dark, lit only by the pale wash of a half-moon through the pine canopy. But Emma knew it by memory, by the particular way the roots crossed the ground, and the hollow log that appeared on the left after the first bend. The air smelled of cold earth and pine resin, and the distant dampness of the river, and she breathed it in until the smell of candle wax and Cedric's wine had left her lungs entirely. She did not hear the footsteps behind her. She would not have, even if she had been listening. The man following her had been trained since childhood to move through forests without disturbing a single dry branch, and he had 40 years of instinct that went deeper than training. Ronan had left the banquet through the western corridor, exchanged a word with his second, crossed the inner yard, and reached the eastern gate 4 minutes after Emma. Oswin had opened the door without being asked, and had looked at the Alpha King with the expression of a man who had decided, some decades ago, that the business of kings was not his business, and had said only, "River path, my lord, muddy past the 2nd pine." Ronan had nodded and stepped through. He followed at a distance that kept her completely unaware of him, far enough that her scent reached him only as a thread in the cold air, close enough that he did not lose the pale gray shape of her cloak between the trees. He told himself, in the detached and analytical way he approached most things, that he was simply ensuring the safety of a servant who had chosen to walk alone in the dark. It was a reasonable thing for a king to do. It was responsible governance. He did not examine this reasoning too closely. He heard the river before he saw it, the fast-running current that Emma had described without knowing she was being heard, to Sarah once in the kitchen corridor when she thought they were alone. "It's loud enough to drown out everything," she had said, and at the time Ronan had been passing through on his way to the armory, and had not paused, had not reacted, had filed the information away in the part of his mind that filed things about Emma without his permission. He stopped at the tree line. She had reached the bank. The river was wide and pale in the moonlight, the water catching silver where it ran over shallow stones. Emma stood at the edge of it, her boots just clear of the waterline, and she had pushed the hood of her cloak back so that her braided hair caught the light. She stood very still for a long moment, her face turned toward the current. Then she sat down on a flat-topped rock at the water's edge, drew her knees up slightly, and began to talk. Ronan went very still. She was not talking to herself, he realized after a moment. She was talking to someone. Her voice was low enough that the river almost covered it, but he was close enough, and his hearing was sharp enough, to catch the words in fragments. "I know you cannot hear me. I know it does not work that way." A pause. The water ran. But I still come because it feels like you are here somehow, because you always love the sound of water. He looked more carefully at the bank. There was a stone at the base of the flat rock, not a natural river stone. It was too smooth, too deliberately placed, slightly darker than the surrounding earth. And propped against it, half hidden by a fold of Emma's cloak, was a small object he could not immediately identify. Emma reached into the folds of her cloak and produced something small, held it in both hands for a moment. In the moonlight it looked like a folded piece of cloth, something very old, kept soft from long handling. She pressed it briefly to her chest, the way someone holds a thing they cannot afford to lose. She would have been 5 this winter, Emma said quietly, and her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something. I think she would have had your eyes. I think she would have been very loud. A short sound, not quite a laugh. I would have loved that. I would have loved every bit of that. Ronan stood at the tree line and did not move. He had ruled Ironvale for 12 years. He had sat in judgment over battles and betrayals, over debts of blood and broken oaths. He had seen grief in many forms, the loud kind, the violent kind, the kind that hardened into hatred. He had never seen it kept quite like this, carried quietly to a river in the dark, set down gently before a small stone, spoken to in a voice that asked for nothing from anyone. His chest felt strange. He recognized the sensation distantly, the way one recognizes a word in a language half forgotten. Emma sat by the river for a while longer. She spoke a few more words he did not hear. Then she folded the small cloth carefully, returned it to her cloak, and stood. She straightened her spine with the particular determination of someone who has allowed themselves one private moment and is now closing the door on it. She walked back toward the tree line. Ronan stepped back into the shadows without a sound, letting her pass close enough that he could have reached out and touched the edge of her cloak. She did not see him. She moved with her eyes forward and her shoulders set, her boots quiet on the pine needle path. He waited until she was well ahead before he followed. He did not look back at the small stone by the river, but he knew he would not forget it. He would not forget any of this. Emma did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow bed of the servants' quarters and listened to Sarah's quiet breathing across the room and watched the shadows on the ceiling shift as the torch in the corridor outside burned low. The river had helped, as it always did, had emptied her enough that the weight was bearable again. But sleep was another matter entirely. Sleep required a stillness she had not yet recovered. She rose before dawn. This was not unusual. Emma was always the first servant awake in the East Wing, a habit born from years of needing to be useful before anyone could question her presence. She dressed in the dark, braided her hair by feel, and slipped into the corridor with her cloak over her arm and her boots in her hand so as not to wake Sarah. The kitchen was cold and gray at that hour, the great hearth reduced to orange embers that she coaxed back to life with dry wood and patience. She set water to heat, measured out the grain for the morning porridge, checked the bread that had been left to rise overnight. These were her tasks, and she did them with the focused attention she gave to everything. Not because she feared punishment for doing them badly, but because doing things well was the only form of dignity available to her in this place. She was alone for almost an hour before the kitchen filled with the others. No one mentioned the banquet. No one mentioned Cedric. Either they did not know about the ribbon and the courtyard and the 3 months of careful hope, or they knew and were decent enough to say nothing. Emma preferred not to determine which. By mid-morning she had been assigned to the upper library. The upper library of Ironvale Keep was one of the few places in the castle that Emma genuinely loved. It occupied the entire top floor of the North Tower, 3 levels of shelves carved directly into the stone, filled with scrolls and leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and old ink, and something faintly sweet she had never been able to identify. The windows were tall and narrow, and on clear mornings the light came through them in long pale columns that moved slowly across the floor as the hours passed. She had been assigned to clean and catalog it twice a month for 2 years, and in that time she had read, quietly and carefully, more books than most lords in the keep. She was on the second level, running a cloth along a high shelf, when she heard the door open below. She did not look down immediately. Visitors to the upper library were rare but not unknown. Occasionally, a pack elder came to consult the territorial records, or one of the younger wolves came to look important in front of visiting clan members. Emma continued her work and waited for whoever it was to find what they needed and leave. The footsteps on the stone staircase were unhurried. They had a particular weight and spacing she recognized before she had consciously decided to recognize anything. She turned. Ronan stood at the top of the stairs. He was not dressed for ceremony today. No formal armor, no clan regalia. He wore a plain leather vest over a dark shirt, the straps across his chest without decoration, his long braided hair loose over one shoulder. He looked, Emma thought involuntarily, like someone who had woken early and come here without planning to. His ice blue eyes found her immediately. "My lord." She stepped back from the shelf and dipped her head. "Don't." His voice was quiet, not unkind, simply direct. He came to stand at the railing of the second level and looked out over the shelves below with the air of a man surveying territory. "I am not here for ceremony." Emma waited. This was another skill she had developed, the ability to wait without filling silence with nervous words. "I wanted to speak with you," Ronan said. He turned from the railing and looked at her directly. It was unsettling, that directness. Most people, when they looked at Emma, looked slightly past her, at what she was carrying, where she was going, whether she was in their way. Ronan looked at her as though she was the only thing in the room worth looking at, and had been for some time. "About last night." Emma's hands went still on the cloth. "The banquet, my lord," she said carefully. "I hope the service was satisfactory. If there were any—" "Not the banquet." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. Emma understood then. She did not know how, or how much he knew, but she understood that the conversation had already moved past the territory where she could redirect it toward linen counts and wine service. She folded the cloth in her hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that did not require knowing exactly what he had seen. "You went to the river," Ronan said. It was not an accusation. His voice had the same quality it always had. Level, without performance, carrying only what it meant to carry. "Last night, after the banquet. I had permission from Oswin, my lord. I was back before the 4th bell." "I know." He paused. "I followed you." The air in the library changed. Emma looked at him, really looked for the first time, with the careful attention she usually reserved for pages of old text, and found nothing in his expression that resembled amusement or cruelty, or the particular satisfaction some men took from revealing a surveillance. He looked, if anything, as though he was telling her something he had decided she deserved to know, regardless of what it cost him. "You followed me," she repeated slowly. "Yes. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. A column of morning light moved across the floor between them. "I watched you walk away from Cedric's table," he said. "I watched how you walked, and I made a decision I have not fully accounted for." Emma looked at him. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was doing her best to ignore it. "You heard," she said. It was not about Cedric anymore. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. Some of it. He did not look away. Enough. She turned back to the shelf. Her hands resumed moving, cloth over stone, slow and even. It was not dismissal. It was the only way she knew to hold herself together while speaking about things she had never spoken about to anyone. Not even Sarah. Not fully. "Her name was Neve," Emma said. Her voice was careful and flat. "She was born too early. She lived for 9 days. A pause. The cloth moved. Her father was a traveling merchant who left before she was born. I was 21. I had nothing and no one. I came to Ironvale because a woman in the village said the keep was hiring, and the work was honest. She stopped. That is the whole story, my lord. It is not a long one. It is long enough, Ronan said. Something in the way he said it made her stop moving. She stood with her back to him, and her hand flat against the spines of old books, and she breathed in the smell of dust and ink and the cold stone of the tower. The stone by the river, he said quietly. Did you place it yourself? Yes, in my first winter here. She paused. It seemed wrong to leave her with nothing to mark where she was remembered. The churchyard in the village where she is buried is 3 days' ride from here. I cannot go, so I made a place I could reach. Ronan said nothing for a long time. She heard him move, not toward her, simply shifting his position. And when she finally turned, he was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the window, where the pale winter light came through in long, clean lines. I had a brother, he said. Younger. He died in the territorial war, 12 years ago, before I took the throne. He did not look at her while he said it. There is a place I go, in the northern woods. A specific tree. I have told no one where it is. Emma looked at him. She had lived in Ironvale Keep for 4 years, and in that time she had constructed, carefully and from a distance, a particular understanding of Ronan. Powerful, cold, just, remote. A king so entirely composed that the servants sometimes speculated, half seriously, that he had been built from stone by the old mountain gods, rather than born. She had believed most of this. It had seemed consistent with the evidence. The man standing at the library window, who had followed a grieving servant girl through a dark forest, and was now telling her about a tree in the northern woods, was consistent with none of it. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He turned from the window then. The ice-blue eyes were steady and direct, and held something in them she could not immediately name. Not pity, not the warm performance of sympathy. Something older and quieter than either. Because you kept something alone for a long time, he said. And you should not have had to. Emma opened her mouth, closed it. I will not speak of what I heard to anyone, Ronan continued, and his voice returned to its usual register, calm even, a king's voice. That is yours. But I wanted you to know that I was there, and that what I saw... He paused for just a moment. It was not nothing, Emma. He said her name the way someone says a word they have held in their mouth for a while before speaking it aloud. Then he turned and walked back down the stairs, and his footsteps faded, and the library was quiet again except for the sound of the light moving across the floor. Emma stood very still between the shelves for a long time. Then she pressed her fingers to the spines of the books beside her, breathed in the smell of old ink and cold stone, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had been seen by the right pair of eyes. 3 days passed before Emma saw Ronan again. In those 3 days, she carried the library conversation the way she carried most things. Carefully, in a pocket close to her chest, not examining it too often for fear of wearing it thin. She went about her work. She served at meals, cleaned the upper corridors, helped Sarah mend the great hall curtains that had frayed at the bottom from years of cold drafts. She did not go to the river. She did not need to, quite yet. Cedric and Mira departed on the second morning, their Ashford retinue riding out through the main gate in a procession of red and gold that Emma did not watch from the window. Sarah watched it for her and reported back with the particular economy of a loyal friend. Gone. Good riddance. The woman's perfume is still in the east corridor, and I resent it. Emma had almost smiled at that. On the third day, word moved through the servants' quarters the way word always moved, faster than horses, quieter than wind. The Alpha King had summoned the Pack Council. There was to be a formal assembly in the Great Hall that evening, all senior members of the Ironvale Pack required to attend. The nature of the assembly was unspecified, which was unusual. Ronan typically announced the subject of councils in advance. The absence of that information generated by midday approximately 40 different theories among the kitchen staff alone. Emma heard them all and said nothing. She was assigned to serve at the assembly. She had expected this. Every available servant was pulled for formal occasions, and she prepared herself with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Plain dress, leather belt, hair braided back. She took her position along the wall with the other servants as the council members filed in and took their seats around the great stone table. Ronan entered last. He always entered last. Emma had noticed this years ago. The way he waited until every other person was seated before he came through the door, unhurried, without announcement, as though arriving at a place he had already owned for a long time. He wore the formal leather of his rank tonight, the dark straps across his chest, carrying the iron clasp of the Iron Veil crest, his braided hair pulled back. He sat at the head of the table, and the room went very quiet, without him asking it to. Emma stood along the wall and looked at the middle distance the way she always did, and waited. "There is a matter of territory," Ronan began, his voice carrying without effort to every corner of the hall. "Clan Morrow has petitioned for access to the southern river crossing. This is the third petition in 2 years. The council will hear the argument, and I will make a determination tonight." This was routine enough. Emma let the discussion wash over her. Borders and rites of passage and the particular stubbornness of Lord Morrow, who was seated at the table and who made his case with the verbose persistence of a man who believed that enough words, arranged carefully enough, could substitute for a strong position. Around her, the other servants moved quietly with wine and water. She refilled cups, stepped back, waited. She was reaching across to set a cup before one of the pack elders when she heard Cedric's name. Her hand steadied. She set the cup down without a sound and stepped back. It was the elder Bowen who had said it, a lean, white-haired wolf of 70 who had served on the Iron Veil Council since before Ronan's father's time, and who had, in Emma's experience, the quality of a man who said exactly what he thought and considered this a virtue rather than a liability. "The Ashford boy," Bowen said, leaning forward on his elbows. "Cedric. There is talk, my lord, that before his announcement of the Morrow girl he made certain." He paused with the delicacy of an old man choosing words that are technically accurate. "Certain representations, to a member of this household." The table went still. Emma felt the blood leave her face. She stood against the wall and kept her expression perfectly neutral, and looked at the middle distance and did not move. "I am aware of the matter," Ronan said. His voice had not changed at all. It was exactly what it always was. Level, deliberate, carrying only what he intended it to carry. "The girl is a servant," said Lord Price from the far end of the table. He was younger than Bowen, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man whose opinions had never been seriously challenged. "Ashford made her no formal offer. There is no breach of pack law." "There is no breach of pack law," Ronan agreed. Price nodded, apparently satisfied. "There is, however," Ronan continued in exactly the same tone, "a breach of something else." Price looked up. "A member of this pack, of this household, was led to hold an expectation that was then dissolved publicly, without warning, on a night of formal assembly." Ronan's eyes moved slowly around the table. They did not stop at the wall where Emma stood. "The rank of the person involved does not change the nature of what was done. A wolf who makes a promise and abandons it under social pressure is not a wolf this pack has reason to respect, regardless of whose colors he wears." The silence in the hall had a particular texture now, not the silence of boredom or routine, but the silence of people recalibrating. "My lord," said Bowen carefully, "what is it you are proposing?" "I am not proposing anything regarding Cedric of Ashford," Ronan said. "He has left our territory. What he does with his choices is his affair." He paused. "I am proposing something regarding this household." He reached to the side and picked up a folded document from the table, a formal scroll, sealed with the Iron Veil crest in black wax. He set it flat on the table in front of him. "Emma of the East Wing has served this keep for 4 years," he said. "She has done so with a standard of work and character that exceeds what this household has required of her and what this household has offered her in return." Another pause. The room was absolutely still. "I am formally reclassifying her position. She will no longer serve as a general servant. She will be assigned to the records and library of the keep as its permanent curator and archivist, with full pack member status, quarters in the main wing, and a seat at the lower table during formal assemblies." Emma forgot to look at the middle distance. She was looking directly at Ronan before she could stop herself. He was not looking back at her. His eyes were on the council, steady and unremarkable, as though he had just announced a minor adjustment to the border patrol schedule. Lord Price cleared his throat. "My lord, the position of pack archivist has traditionally been held by whoever I assign it to," Ronan said without heat. "That has always been the tradition. I am upholding it now." Price closed his mouth. Bowen, at the other end of the table, looked down at the surface of the table with the expression of a man concealing something that might, if it escaped, turn out to be a smile. The rest of the assembly passed in a blur of motion and sound that Emma processed from a very great distance. The Morrow petition was addressed. Determinations were made. The council filed out. The servants cleared the table. Emma moved through all of it with her hands doing their work automatically, while the rest of her stood very still, in the center of something she did not yet have words for. Sarah found her in the corridor afterward and grabbed both her hands. "I was at the back of the hall," Sarah said, her eyes bright and her voice low and fierce. "I heard everything. Emma, look at me." Emma looked at her. "You are the pack archivist," Sarah said. "He gave you pack member status, in front of the full council." "I know. Do you understand what that means? You are no longer—" "I know," Emma said again, and her voice came out slightly uneven in a way she had not intended. Sarah looked at her for a moment, then pulled her into a brief, hard embrace that Emma received with both arms, and held for longer than she usually allowed herself. "He saw you," Sarah said quietly, against her shoulder. "He actually saw you." Emma closed her eyes. She thought about the library, the column of morning light on the stone floor, the way he had said her name, as though he had been holding it carefully for a while before deciding the moment was right to set it down. It was not nothing, Emma. She had not known, when he said it, how much nothing she had been surviving on. She knew now. Late that night, after the keep had grown quiet and the torches in the corridors burned low, Emma took the small folded cloth from inside her cloak, the one she brought to the river, the one she had pressed to her chest in the moonlight, and she sat on the edge of her bed and held it in her hands. "Something changed," she said quietly to the cloth, to Neve, to the particular kind of listening that grief made possible. "I do not know yet what it means, but I wanted to tell you." She sat with it for a while. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it back against her chest, and lay down in the dark. And for the first time in a very long time, she slept before the torch burned out. The new quarters were on the 3rd floor of the main wing, 2 rooms with a window that faced east and caught the morning light before anywhere else in the keep. There was a writing desk, a proper bed with a wool mattress, and shelves already built into the wall that Emma immediately began to fill with the cataloging materials she had been given access to from the library stores. Sarah helped her move her few possessions from the East Wing in a single trip. It did not take long, because Emma had always owned very little, and stood in the doorway afterward looking at the room with an expression of fierce satisfaction. "This is where you were supposed to be," Sarah said. "From the beginning." Emma looked at the morning light on the stone floor and said nothing, because some things were too full to answer. Her work as archivist began the following day. The upper library had been maintained adequately over the years but never systematically, and Emma discovered within the first hour that the territorial records alone represented decades of misfiling that would take months to properly organize. She did not mind. Order emerging from disorder was work she understood at a level that had nothing to do with training. She was deep in the second level of shelves, cross-referencing a stack of boundary agreements from the previous generation, when Ronan appeared at the top of the stairs. She had been half expecting this, in the way one half expects weather that has been building for days. "My lord," she said. "Archivist," he replied, and something in the way he said the word, quiet, deliberate, as though he had decided to use it as a kind of declaration, made her set down the scroll in her hands. He came to stand at the table where she was working, and looked at the organized stacks, with the calm attention he gave to everything. She watched him from the corner of her eye and waited. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me nothing, my lord. What you did in the council was not charity," he said. "It was not sharp, but it was final." He looked at her directly. "I want you to understand that. It was not charity, and it was not pity, and it was not a king managing his household efficiently, although I am prepared to defend it on all three grounds if the council requires it." A pause. The morning light moved. It was a choice, about something specific. Emma looked at him. "I have watched you for 2 years," Ronan said. The words came with the particular care of someone who has decided to be precise rather than impressive. Not in the manner of surveillance, in the manner of noticing, the way you work, the way you speak to people who have less power than you, which is the truest measure of a person's character I have ever found, the way you carry things that would have broken someone else and do not speak of them as burdens. He stopped. "I noticed, for a long time, and I did nothing with what I noticed because I did not believe you would consider it welcome, coming from me." "Why would you think that?" Emma asked, and her voice was careful but genuine. "Because I am not an easy thing to be near," he said. It was said without self-pity, simply as a fact he had long since made peace with. "My rank creates distance. My nature creates more. Most people in this keep are afraid of me in some measure, and I have accepted that as the cost of what I am." He paused. "You are not afraid of me." "No," Emma agreed quietly. "That is rarer than you know." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like a door opening a precise and measured amount. "When I followed you to the river, I told myself it was concern for your safety. That was not entirely untrue, but it was not entirely true either." He held her gaze. "I wanted to know where you went when you carried something too heavy for stone walls. I wanted to know what you were like when no one was watching." Emma thought about the riverbank, the moonlight, her own voice speaking to a small stone in the dark. "And what did you find?" she asked. "Someone I had no right to admire as much as I already did," he said. The library was very quiet. Below them, somewhere in the keep, a door opened and closed. The distant sound of the courtyard carried up, horses, voices, the ordinary noise of a day continuing without concern for what was happening in the North Tower. Emma looked at the man standing across the table from her, the Alpha King of Iron Vale, who had braided hair and ice-blue eyes and a tree in the northern woods where he went alone, who had watched her for 2 years and said nothing, who had followed her through a dark forest, not to surveil her, but to understand her. And she felt something settle in her chest, with the quiet finality of a stone finding the bottom of still water. "I am not easy either," she said. "I carry things quietly, and that is sometimes mistaken for simplicity. I am not simple." She paused. "And I have a grief that does not go away. It becomes manageable. It does not disappear." "I know," Ronan said. "I am not asking it to." "I need to know that is true before anything else," she said. "Not as a servant speaking to a king, as a person speaking to another person." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved around the edge of the table, not quickly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and stopped an arm's length from her, Up close, the ice-blue eyes were not cold at all. They were the color of winter sky just before it changes. "Neve," he said quietly. "Her name was Neve. You told me she would have been loud." The corner of his mouth moved. The smallest possible shift, barely a shadow of something warmer. "I think loud children are generally an asset." Emma's breath caught. It was such a small thing. The name, spoken aloud by someone other than herself for the first time in 4 years. Not as a sorrow to be managed, just as a name. As a real thing that had existed and mattered and been heard. She did not cry. She was still very practiced at that. But she stood very still and let the name settle in the air between them, and did not look away from him. "Yes," she said when she could. "I think she would have been." What followed was not sudden. Neither of them were people who moved suddenly toward anything. Through the winter, Ronan came to the library regularly, sometimes with genuine questions about the territorial records, sometimes with no stated purpose at all, standing at the window while Emma worked, the two of them existing in the same space with a comfort that had taken years to earn, without either of them fully knowing they were earning it. He told her about the territorial war in pieces, not all at once. She told him about the village she had come from, the merchant who had not stayed, the 9 days she had spent counting her daughter's breaths. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, with the full weight of his attention. By the time the first thaw came, and the snow on the northern mountains began to release into the rivers, the keep had quietly rearranged its understanding of things. The servants did not gossip maliciously. There was nothing to gossip about, nothing visible or improper. Only the fact that the archivist and the Alpha King were seen in the library most mornings, and that the Alpha King smiled occasionally, in a way that several older members of the keep staff claimed never to have witnessed before in 12 years of his reign. Sarah said nothing about any of it. She simply took the better quarters that opened up in the East Wing when the Ashford retinue's visiting staff departed, and began teaching herself to read using the cataloging primers Emma left on the kitchen windowsill, and considered the matter satisfactorily resolved. On the first true morning of spring, Ronan took Emma to the northern woods. He did not explain where they were going until they arrived. A clearing of white-barked trees, where a single oak stood wider than the others, its bark marked by 12 years of returning seasons. He stood beside it without ceremony, and she stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was the most natural silence Emma had ever shared with another person. "His name was Cale," Ronan said finally. "Tell me about him," Emma said. And he did. In the last days of spring, before the Crescent Moon banquet came around again, Ronan made one more formal address to the Pack Council. It was brief. He informed the council that the archivist Emma had been formally recognized as his chosen companion and would sit at his side at all future assemblies, that her status within the pack was to be recorded in the territorial documents as a permanent matter of record, and that the matter was not subject to council approval, but was being shared as a courtesy. Bowen, at the far end of the table, looked down at the surface again with great concentration. His shoulders moved slightly. Price said nothing. He had learned over the winter that saying nothing was increasingly his best available option. Emma sat at the lower table and heard the words, and felt the truth of them settle into her, the way all true things settled. Not with noise, but with a quiet, permanent weight. She thought of the ribbon she had sewn into a hem. She thought of the small stone by the river. She thought of a name spoken aloud in a winter library by someone who had understood, without being told, that to speak it was not to wound, but to honor. She thought of Neve, and for the first time in 4 years, the thought arrived without the bracing for pain that had always preceded it. It arrived simply as love, as something that had existed completely and still existed, carried forward into a life that was, improbably and against considerable odds, becoming whole. After the assembly, she walked to the eastern gate. Oswin was on duty. He opened the small door without being asked. "River path," he said. "Not tonight," Emma said. He looked at her for a moment with his gray, unhurried eyes. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who recognizes a change that has been coming for a long time and is glad to see it arrive. She walked back through the keep, through the stone corridors that smelled of torch smoke and old wood, past the great hall where the banners hung, up the stairs of the north tower to the library, where the morning light came through the tall windows, and the shelves held everything that had ever been recorded and remembered in this place. She sat at her desk. She opened the territorial record to a fresh page, and at the top, in her careful, even hand, she wrote the date, the season, and the name of the pack. Then she paused and added one more line. Not a formal entry, not anything the council would read or the archives would require, but something true that deserved to be written down somewhere. Some things are not lost. They are only waiting to be found by the right person. She closed the book. Outside the tall windows, the spring light fell clean and unhurried across the mountains, and somewhere in the keep below, a door opened. Familiar footsteps, unhurried, crossing stone. And Emma smiled before he reached the top of the stairs. She already knew the sound of him. She already knew she was home.